There is something about the ocean that strips men of their arrogance. On the surface, it looks calm, endless, a sheet of blue stretching to the horizon. But beneath that thin veil lies a world that should never be disturbed, a place where sunlight dies and things older than humanity drift in the silence. I learned that quickly as a sonar technician for the U.S. Navy, because my job was not just to listen to the ocean, it was to obey its rules, even the ones that were never written down. The first thing you understand when you step aboard is that curiosity is dangerous. Sonar is meant to detect submarines, ships, sometimes even whales. But the sea does not always give you what you expect. And the worst part is how badly you want to know what it is, to adjust the dials, to lean closer and listen harder. But that is the trap. The ocean does not forgive curiosity. On my first week at sea, I sat in the darkened room, headphones pressed tight against my ears, the glow of the instruments painting everything in cold green light. My supervisor leaned close and muttered words that still chill me to this day. Don't chase what doesn't want to be found. And if you hear something that feels like it's listening back, stop. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating, maybe trying to scare the rookie. But I would soon learn how serious he was. The deeper we sailed, the stranger the sounds became. Some were faint tremors, low rumbles that seemed to roll beneath the ship like thunder buried in water. Others were sharp, rhythmic pulses, too even to be natural, too alien to be familiar. Every instinct in me wanted to catalog them, identify them, trace their origin. But the rules were strict. Never pursue a sound unless ordered. And above all, never try to make sense of it. Because once you start searching, you may discover something you were never meant to find. One night, long into the watch, I heard something different. It began as a faint knocking, irregular, distant. The rhythm shifted, falling into a pattern: 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, then 3 again. It was almost like code, almost like someone calling. My hand hovered over the console, aching to trace the signal. But something in my gut stopped me. The rule was clear: never follow. I removed the headphones, and for a moment, I could still feel the knocking in my skull, as though the sound had sunk into me. When I told my supervisor, he only gave me a long, tired look. Good, he said. You didn't answer. That was all. No explanation. No comfort. Just a warning unspoken in his eyes. From that moment, I realized the ocean is not empty. It listens. It waits. And for those foolish enough to give in to curiosity, it answers. But the answers are never the kind, not then, not ever. When I first signed up as a sonar technician, I thought the rules I'd be following would be technical ones: frequencies, ranges, signal clarity. The kind of regulations that made sense on paper. But the Navy had its own set of instructions for the deep, and many of them were not written in any manual. They were passed down through whispers in the control room, warnings given by men who had seen too much and lived to tell only fragments. The official rules were simple: monitor, record, report. The unofficial ones were much stranger, and those were the ones that truly mattered. The first was to never describe out loud what you thought you heard. We were told that the ocean had ways of echoing words back to us, and once it echoed, it never forgot. The second was to never, under any circumstance, repeat a sound back. Even if it came in the form of Morse code, even if it sounded like distress. Especially then. Mimicry, they said, was the sea's most dangerous trick. The third rule was harder to understand at first. If the water ever went silent, completely silent, with no fish, no whales, no mechanical hum, then you were not to speak. Not a single word. Not even a whisper. The silence was never empty. It was waiting. The older crew members would look at one another nervously when it happened. Their lips pressed tight, their hands gripping the consoles until sound returned. I asked once what would happen if someone broke the silence, and the reply I got was a grim stare that told me not to ask again. It didn't take long before I experienced it myself. One night, while monitoring a routine patrol, the noise cut out. Just like that, gone. One moment the background crackle and distant echoes filled my ears. The next, absolute nothing. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you believe you've gone deaf. The men around me froze. No one dared move. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what was happening. but a hand shot out and gripped my arm with a strength that surprised me. My supervisor's eyes locked onto mine, wide and furious, and he shook his head slowly. Not a sound. We sat there for what felt like hours but could only have been minutes. The ship itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the noise returned. A rush of static, distant life. The thrum of the deep restored. The room exhaled in unison. Only then did my supervisor release me, muttering under his breath, "Rule 3. Never forget it." I began to understand then that the ocean is not a void. It is a presence vast and ancient, and the rules were not superstition. They were survival. Every instruction was written in blood, forged from the mistakes of those who thought the sea was just water and depth. That night, when my shift ended, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how much the Navy must know, how many encounters had been buried under secrecy, hidden from the world. The manuals may have taught us how to read signals, but the real training, the true rules, were teaching us something else entirely. We weren't just listening to the ocean was listening back. And I had a sickening feeling that soon, I would learn why these rules existed. There are sounds the ocean makes that defy explanation. Whales sing, yes. The shifting of tectonic plates can echo like thunder. Even ice breaking in the poles can crack like distant gunfire. But there are other sounds, ones that seem too deliberate, too human. Those are the ones that kept me awake at night. The first time I heard it, I thought it was interference. The headphones hissed with static, the kind you get when a signal breaks apart. But hidden in that crackling noise was something else. A voice. Faint, broken, as if whispered through miles of water. At first, I couldn't make out the words. It was only a rhythm, syllables pulled apart by static. Then, slowly, they sharpened. A man's voice, low and steady, repeating a single phrase. "Do you hear me?" My blood ran cold. I ripped the headphones away, convinced it was a trick of fatigue. But when I put them back on, the words were clearer. "Do you hear me?" Over and over, the same desperate question, buried in the noise of the deep. I reported it to my supervisor, expecting him to dismiss it. Instead, his face drained of color. He didn't ask me to replay it, didn't ask for details. He simply said, "Log it as interference and delete it. Do not mention it again." His voice carried no room for argument. But I couldn't forget. That night, lying in my bunk, I still heard the question echoing in my ears, as if it had burrowed into me. "Do you hear me?" I told myself it had to be radio bleed, maybe some fisherman's signal bouncing across the water. But deep down, I knew better. The cadence was wrong. The sound had weight to it, as though it wasn't traveling through air at all, but through water thick enough to drag the syllables down. Over the following weeks, others began to report the same phenomenon. Quiet voices in the static, always asking questions, always sounding just beyond the edge of clarity. Some heard their names spoken, whispered so faintly they weren't sure if it was real. Others swore they heard commands, urging them to adjust dials, to tune deeper into the noise. And then came the worst of them. One night, a technician sitting 2 chairs down from me suddenly froze. He pulled his headphones off slowly, his face pale, his eyes glassy. Without a word, he stood and walked to the bulkhead, pressing his ear against the cold metal. His lips moved, whispering something none of us could hear. Took 3 men to drag him away. When we asked him what he was doing, he simply muttered, "She was calling me." He refused to explain further. He was transferred the next morning. I never saw him again. That was when I realized the voices were not accidents, not mere static. They were purposeful, intelligent. They knew we were there. And the question that haunted me most was not who they were, but how they knew. The rule about not responding suddenly made sense. Because if you answered, even with a whisper, something in the depths might answer back. And I wasn't sure anyone would survive what it had to say. It is one thing to hear voices in the static, but it is another to feel them press against you, demanding a reply. That was the hardest rule for me to understand at first. Why the silence, why the refusal to acknowledge? But I would learn, as everyone eventually does, that the ocean does not tolerate conversation. The official line was that our sonar was sensitive enough to catch fragments of stray transmissions, and that engaging them could compromise operations. But every man aboard knew the truth. The voices were not from any ship, and they did not belong to any living crew. They were something else, something woven into the dark fabric of the sea itself. One night, during a long stretch of patrol, the rule was broken. I was in the control room when it happened. A junior technician had been monitoring a signal that pulsed faintly in the headphones, almost rhythmic like a distress beacon. We all leaned in, straining to catch it. And then, clear as daylight, a voice spoke through the static. "Help us!" The technician froze. His eyes darted to his console, then to us, as though waiting for someone to give permission. No one did. The silence in that room was heavier than the steel walls around us. And then, against every protocol, against every warning, he whispered into the mic, "Who are you?" The words had barely left his mouth when the static erupted. It wasn't noise. It was a roar, a deep, grinding howl that seemed to vibrate through the hull itself. The lights flickered. My teeth ached from the pressure of the sound. And in the middle of that chaos, I swear I heard laughter. Not human laughter, but something stretched thin, mocking, like the sea itself had heard his reply and was amused. The technician ripped his headset off, clutching his ears. Blood trickled between his fingers. He screamed that something had answered him. Something was inside his head. He kept repeating it until he was dragged out of the room, thrashing like a man drowning on dry land. He was never brought back. His bunk was cleared before morning, and we were told not to ask questions. After that night, I understood why the rule existed. Responding wasn't just dangerous, it was an invitation. The sea was patient, always waiting, always whispering. It did not want communication. It wanted permission. And once you gave it, even by accident, it never let go. I began to dread the headphones after that, dreading the long watches where I would sit in silence, praying that nothing called my name, that no voice slid between the crackle of static and asked for me directly. Because if it did, I wasn't sure I would be strong enough not to answer. And somewhere deep in my bones, I felt that the sea knew this. It knew how thin the line was between discipline and temptation. That was why the rules were carved into us, passed down with such severity. Because one slip was all it took. One word, one reply, and then the ocean would own you. There is a kind of silence at sea that does not belong to this world. It isn't peaceful and it isn't calm. It's the kind of silence that smothers, that presses into your lungs and makes you feel as though the ocean itself is holding its breath. Every sailor dreads it, every technician fears it, and it is the reason behind one of the most unforgiving rules of all. When the depths grow too quiet, you must not speak. The first time it happened to me, I thought the equipment had failed. One moment, the headphones were filled with the hum of the sea, distant echoes, the songs of whales, the crack of pressure shifting in the abyss, and the next, nothing. Not even static. Just a blankness so complete that it felt as though sound itself had been stolen away. I adjusted the dials, checked the connections, but everything was fine. The silence was not a fault. It was deliberate. The room around me froze. No one moved. No one even coughed. The air felt heavy, and I noticed the crew avoiding each other's eyes. Their jaws clenched tight as though afraid to let a word slip out. My instinct screamed to ask what was happening. But then I remembered the rule. Not a sound. Not even a whisper. So I sat there, staring at the shifting green glow of the instruments, my heartbeat thundering in my chest. The longer the silence stretched, the more unbearable it became. It wasn't just absence. It felt alive, pressing against the hull like an unseen tide. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, not from above or behind, but from below. Something vast, patient, waiting just beneath us. When the silence finally broke, it wasn't gradual. It returned all at once. A flood of static, clicks, and echoes bursting back into my ears so violently that I almost cried out. I saw one of the older crew members exhale with relief, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Only then did I understand that the silence was never empty. It was the sign of something passing by. Later, when I found the courage to ask about it, a petty officer gave me the closest thing to an answer. He said, "It means something's near, something big enough to hush the sea. And if it wants quiet, you give it quiet, or it will notice you." His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. I never asked again. From then on, every time the silence came, I obeyed. I kept my mouth shut, even as sweat rolled down my neck, even as my chest ached to breathe louder than I should. And though I never saw what moved beneath us, I felt it. The way the ship seemed to hang in suspension, like a toy above a predator. The way the silence coiled tight before snapping back with the rush of life. Those moments made me realize that we were intruders in a world not meant for us. And the ocean, in its endless patience, allowed us to survive only because we followed its rules. But even rules can be broken. And I would soon learn what happened when something beneath the waves decided that silence wasn't enough. It was deep into a patrol when I first saw it, the thing no sonar technician ever wants to witness. Shapes on the screen are familiar to us. Submarines, schools of fish, whales, geological formations, wreckage. The training drills every outline into your head until you can recognize them in an instant. But what I saw that night was none of those. It was something entirely different, something that had no right to exist. The sonar display flickered with the soft waves of static green, ripples mapping out the unseen world below. At first, it appeared as a distortion, a faint blur at the edge of range, as though the machine itself hesitated to register it. I thought it was interference, perhaps even a fault in the system. But then it shifted. It moved. The lines bent around it. A shadow with mass, impossibly large and strangely shaped. It wasn't the smooth curve of a whale or the hard geometry of a vessel. It was jagged, irregular, almost like it was shifting as I watched. The technicians beside me fell silent, staring at the screens as the image grew sharper. It had no symmetry, no pattern that made sense to the human eye. The only word that came to mind was wrong. The captain was called immediately, and I'll never forget his expression when he leaned over the console. It wasn't shock, not at first, it was recognition. His jaw tightened, and without hesitation, he ordered us to power down all unnecessary systems. The lights dimmed, the ship slowed, and an uneasy hush fell over the entire crew. We were trying to make ourselves invisible, but the thing was still there, moving, following. Through the headphones, I could hear the faintest sound, low, resonant, like the groan of metal under immense pressure. Except it wasn't the ship. It was coming from outside. The vibrations pulsed through my skull, and with each pulse, the image on the sonar seemed to ripple, as though its very shape refused to stay constant. One of the younger sailors whispered that it looked like an eye. Another swore he could see teeth in the distortion. I told myself they were imagining things, but deep down I wasn't sure. The human brain tries to find patterns, even in chaos. And yet, the longer I looked, the more it felt as though the sonar wasn't showing us its outline. It was showing us only what it wanted us to see. And then, without warning, the shape vanished. Gone as though it had never been there. The screen cleared, the sounds faded, and the silence that followed was so heavy that it made my heart pound like a drum. We all looked at one another, waiting for an explanation that never came. The captain gave none. He simply told us to resume normal operations and left the room, his face pale and unreadable. That night, lying in my bunk, I could still feel the low vibrations in my bones, echoing like a memory I couldn't shake. I closed my eyes and saw the shape on the screen, jagged and shifting, as though it were burned into the back of my eyelids. And worse, I felt, truly felt, that whatever it was, it had seen us. Not just detected us. Seen us. And once something like that sees you, it does not forget. The ocean has a way of reminding you that steel is nothing more than a fragile skin stretched thin against an endless pressure. Inside the submarine, we liked to believe we were safe, sealed away from the void outside. But sometimes, when the hull groaned and the pipes shuddered, you could feel the truth, that only a few inches of metal stood between you and the crushing weight of the abyss. And there were times when even that barrier felt thinner than it should. It began with the sounds. The first was faint, like a tapping on the outside of the vessel. At that depth, no diver could possibly exist, no machinery could drift so low without being torn apart. Yet the tapping persisted, irregular, almost curious, like fingers drumming idly against a desk. At first we dismissed it, telling ourselves it was nothing more than debris shifting against the current. But it was too deliberate, too intentional. The second sound was worse. A scrape, long and slow, as though claws or something far sharper were dragging themselves along the outer hull. The vibrations shivered through the steel, rattling bolts, crawling up my teeth until I felt them ache. Every man in the sonar room went pale, none daring to speak aloud what we were all thinking. Whatever it was not drifting. It was moving. It was searching. I remember the way the older sailors avoided looking at one another, their jaws tight, their hands trembling just slightly as they adjusted the dials and logged their reports with false calm. They had heard it before. They knew what followed. I was the one still learning. At night, in my bunk, the sounds became clearer. A dull thud, as if something massive brushed against us. A low hum that vibrated through the walls, resonating like a voice too deep to belong to anything human. Once, I swore I heard a groan ripple through the hull, not mechanical, not structural, but something that sounded alive. The others warned me never to look through the observation porthole, the small, thick glass hidden deep within the ship. Most of the crew pretended it didn't exist. But curiosity gnawed at me. One watch, when the scraping grew unbearable, I slipped away and found it. Peering out, all I saw at first was blackness, the suffocating dark of the ocean's midnight zone, where no light had ever reached. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed movement. Not fish, not drifting shadows, but something immense gliding just beyond the edge of visibility. It wasn't a shape so much as an absence, a void within the void, and as it shifted, I caught the faintest glimmer of something slick, something that reflected the little light our vessel emitted. I stumbled back, breath catching in my throat. I couldn't name what I had seen, couldn't draw its outline in my mind, but I knew with every part of me that it had been aware of my gaze. That scrape, that tapping, it hadn't been random. It had been knocking, testing, waiting for someone to answer, and I had looked. I had acknowledged it. That night, when I closed my eyes, I swore I could still feel it, brushing against the hull, circling us, patient as the deep. Whatever lurked out there wasn't gone. It was waiting, and I was starting to believe that the rules weren't just to protect us from mistakes. They were to protect us from what was already watching. Rules on a submarine are more than orders, they are survival itself. We were drilled to obey without hesitation, because hesitation was death. But there are always men who believe they are stronger than fear, men who think that discipline is just a mask for superstition. And when those men break protocol, the ocean does not forgive. It began with whispers in the mess. Some of the younger crew had grown restless, tired of the constant silence, tired of living by rules they didn't fully understand. They laughed about the warnings, muttered that all the stories of tapping and voices were nothing more than tricks of the mind. At first, it was harmless rebellion, jokes spoken too loudly, bets made over coffee. But rebellion grows quickly in tight quarters, and soon, their defiance turned into action. One night, during a long and heavy watch, the silence fell again. The same suffocating void that told us something vast was moving in the depths. The rule was clear. No talking, no noise, no acknowledgement. But one of them broke. A chuckle slipped out, loud and jarring in that sacred stillness. Another man added a mocking whistle, short and sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. The room froze. The rest of us sat paralyzed, fear pinning us to our seats. I could feel the weight of the silence shift, as though the ocean itself had turned its head toward us. And then, through the static in my headphones, I heard it, something answering. It wasn't a voice, not in the human sense, but a low resonance, a deep pulse that echoed like laughter stretched across miles of water. It wasn't distant. It was right outside. The captain's fury was immediate. He stormed into the room, his face pale with rage, ordering the men dragged out before they could open their mouths again. But the damage had already been done. The sound returned. Scraping, knocking, pressing against the hull as though something had been invited inside our orbit. The atmosphere in the sub turned poisonous with dread. The next day, the men who had mocked the rules were gone. Officially, they had been relocated to another vessel for disciplinary action. But their bunks were cleared without ceremony, and their names were never spoken again. Some said they were confined. Others whispered they had been cast off during the night, a sacrifice to appease the depths. None of us dared ask the truth. What haunted me most wasn't their disappearance, but the silence that followed. It was different from before, heavier, more purposeful. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear the faint rhythm of tapping, but it was slower now, deliberate, as though whatever was outside no longer needed to search. It already knew where we were. It was lingering, waiting. I learned then that protocol wasn't about keeping us safe. It was about keeping something else contained. The rules weren't just commands from the Navy. They were bargains. And the men who broke them had broken more than orders. They had broken the pact that kept the ocean's interest at bay. And the sea never forgets a broken bargain. There are signals the Navy tells us to ignore. Fragments of static, distorted messages from other vessels, echoes bouncing from the ocean floor. We are trained to catalog, dismiss, and move on. But every so often, something comes through the headphones that does not fit into any category. Something so wrong that the only thing you can do is pretend you never heard it. It happened during the third week of that patrol. The silence had lifted, and the sea seemed restless, filled with crackles and faint rhythms in the deep. I was at my post when a new sound slid into the static. A voice, clear and steady, speaking through the murk. At first, I thought it was a transmission from another submarine. But the more I listened, the more dread crawled across my skin. It was speaking English, calm, deliberate, but the cadence was off. The pauses between words were too long, the pitch shifting in unnatural ways, as though the voice were imitating speech rather than forming it. It repeated the same phrase again and again. "Do you hear us? Do you hear us?" I ripped the headphones off, my heart hammering. When I looked around, I realized the others had heard it too. Their faces were pale, their lips tight, but none of them dared move or speak. The rule was clear, never respond. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, filling every corner of the static, demanding, "Do you hear us?" The captain entered, stone-faced, and without a word, cut power to the transmission channel. The voice was severed instantly, the silence returning like a blade to the throat. But I could still feel it pressing in around us, like an echo that wasn't bound by the equipment. That night I couldn't sleep. The phrase repeated in my head, over and over, until I realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice hadn't said, "Do you hear me?" It had said, "Do you hear us?" And whatever us was, it hadn't been speaking alone. 2 days later, another technician swore he heard the same transmission during his watch. He claimed it whispered his name between the words. By morning, he was gone, his station reassigned, his belongings cleared without explanation. The officers gave us no answers, but none were needed. We all knew he had listened too closely. From then on, every flicker in the static made me flinch. Every murmur beneath the hum of the sonar felt like bait, waiting for someone to give in. Because the voices weren't searching for communication. They were searching for acknowledgement, for proof that we could hear them. And God help us, we did. Every rule we lived by had been hammered into us with merciless precision. Do not respond. Do not look too long. Do not speak when the silence comes. But there was one final rule, the one never written in any manual, never spoken above a whisper. It was the rule no one dared to test, because those who did were never seen again. It came to me during the last nights of that patrol. We had endured the voices, the scraping, the silence. We had felt the weight of something vast circling us in the blackness. Yet still, there was one truth none of us spoke aloud. The ocean doesn't simply watch. It waits. And when it calls, you cannot refuse. The final rule was simple, brutal, and absolute. When the ocean chooses you, you do not resist. The unlucky few it marked were taken without ceremony. A technician would vanish from his bunk, a sailor would fail to report for duty, and there would be no alarms, no search. The officers never explained. They only said the man had been transferred. But we all knew the truth. On my last watch, I felt it happen. The silence fell heavier than ever before, pressing against the hull until my ears rang. Through the static, I heard not a voice, but a breath, slow, deep, impossibly close. Then, as if spoken from just beyond the metal skin of the vessel, I heard my name. Clear, icy, undeniable. My blood froze. Every instinct screamed to obey the rules, to stay silent, to keep my eyes locked forward, to pretend I hadn't heard. But the voice lingered, curling around me like water rising in a sealed room. My name again, and again, each time louder, closer, as though the hull itself were whispering it. I knew what it meant. The ocean had chosen me. I ripped off my headset, trembling, and looked to the others. Their faces told me everything. They hadn't heard the voice. Only me. Their eyes dropped quickly, avoiding mine. Their silence heavier than the abyss outside. They knew, and they would not intervene. That was the last watch I remember. I never reached my bunk. I never heard the end of that patrol. When I opened my eyes again, I was not aboard the submarine. I was suspended in an endless dark, weightless, soundless, the crushing water pressing from all sides. And in that moment I understood what the final rule meant. No one survives it, because the ocean does not simply claim you, keeps you, and somewhere, beneath the weight of miles of black water, I am still there, listening, waiting,